The hangar at Meridian Aviation had gone quiet in the specific way that large spaces go quiet when everyone present understands that something has just happened that cannot be taken back. 42 people stood in various positions across the floor: technicians, ground crew, a legal assistant near the back wall, 2 pilots by the boarding stairs, and every single one of them had just heard Diana Marsh drop $50 at a man's feet and laugh. The man had not moved. He was standing with his tool bag over one shoulder and a delivery manifest in his hand, and he was looking at the $50 bill on the concrete floor with the expression of someone who had registered something and was deciding what it meant. His name was Devin Cole. He was 41 years old. He ran a small aircraft maintenance operation called Cole Precision on the south end of the Meridian field, close enough to the main facility to catch their overflow work, far enough that nobody from the main building ever thought to wave when they drove past. Diana Marsh was the founder and CEO of Marsh Aerospace Holdings, and she had just offered Devin $5 million if he could start the engine that 12 of her specialists had spent 4 hours failing to start. She had said it the way people said things they were certain would never be collected. Devin looked at the $50 on the floor. He looked at the aircraft, a $65 million long-range business jet that sat in the center of the hangar like a patient nobody had been able to diagnose. He looked at Diana Marsh. Then he said, "Say it again, loud enough that everyone here can confirm they heard it." She said it again. He picked up his tool bag and walked toward the aircraft. Stay until the end, because the $5 million turned out to be the smallest thing at stake. Devin Cole's morning had started the way most of his mornings started, with an invoice he couldn't ignore and a problem he hadn't caused. The invoice was for $68,000, owed by a charter operator who had been promising payment for 11 weeks, and whose calls had recently begun going to voicemail. The problem was a turboprop that had come in the previous evening with a hydraulic fault that the previous shop had misdiagnosed, and which Devin had found and corrected in 40 minutes, and which he was now documenting carefully because the previous misdiagnosis was the kind that left a paper trail someone might try to use later. Cole Precision occupied a converted maintenance bay on the south field. Devin had been running it for 7 years, ever since he left the Navy with a folder of commendations and a daughter who needed someone home before dark. The commendations were in a box under the storage shelves. The daughter, Amara, was 15 now and studying for a biology exam at the kitchen table most mornings when he left, which meant she was either genuinely disciplined or had learned to look disciplined when he walked past, and he had decided not to investigate too closely. The shop employed 5 technicians. It carried certification across 9 engine families. It had, in the past 7 years, built a quiet reputation for finding problems that other operations had given up on or explained away. Not because Devin was more talented than every other mechanic in the region, but because he listened to machines with a patience that most people reserved for other people, and because he had never once signed off on something he didn't believe. He had come to the Meridian main hangar that morning to deliver a set of reconditioned fuel control units, and to try, without being obvious about it, to have a conversation with the facilities coordinator that might lead to a service contract that might lead to the breathing room the shop desperately needed. He pulled through the service gate at 7:15 and understood immediately that something had gone wrong inside the big building. Too many people moving with too much urgency. The Marsh Aerospace flagship jet, a Sovereign-class long-range he had seen on the field before and admired from a distance, sitting in the center of the hangar with 12 technicians distributed across 3 diagnostic stations, and nobody looking like they were close to an answer. Devin signed in at the sign desk, set his delivery case on the counter, and stood still long enough to listen. That was the thing about Devin Cole that people consistently failed to account for. He listened to aircraft the way musicians listened to instruments, not for the individual sounds, but for the relationship between them, the intervals and hesitations that meant something was off in a way no readout would tell you directly. He heard it within 30 seconds. A barely perceptible lag in the auxiliary intake valve response, a half-beat delay that was small enough to dismiss and specific enough to mean something. The sound pattern suggested the engine management computer was receiving a status signal it wasn't designed to receive at that stage of the startup sequence, which meant the computer was interrupting the ignition handoff to protect a system it believed was still in a maintenance configuration. Not a software fault, a mechanical flag that the software was reading correctly. He filed this in the back of his mind and picked up his delivery case. The head of maintenance reached him before he got to the side corridor. His name was Victor Hale. He was a broad man in his late 40s who stood with the weight on his back foot like someone who expected every conversation to end badly and wanted to be positioned to leave. He told Devon that deliveries went through the receiving dock, that the hangar was restricted during active diagnostics, and that a small operation from the South Field didn't exactly have standing to assess a Class 1 business jet. Devon told him what he'd heard, described the lag, offered the interpretation in plain terms. Victor's expression didn't change. He told Devon to leave his delivery and his observations at the door. Diana Marsh had overheard the exchange from 15 feet away. She was operating at a level of controlled stress that had compressed her tolerance for complications to almost nothing. The jet had to depart within 90 minutes for her to reach her destination in time for the closing session of an acquisition negotiation that had taken 2 years to reach this point. 90 minutes was already optimistic. She turned toward Devon with the particular efficiency of someone who had learned to assess people quickly and had long since stopped questioning the assessments. She registered the work jacket, the frayed cuff of the shirt beneath it, the delivery case under his arm, the South Field contractor badge on his chest. She asked him what he thought he was doing in her hangar. He told her the same thing he'd told Victor. She looked at him for a moment with the composed amusement of someone who had already decided how this ended. Then she reached into her blazer pocket, took out a folded $50 bill, and placed it on top of his delivery case. "Go get yourself something," she said, "and clear the restricted area." Devon looked at the 50. He looked at the aircraft. He set the delivery case on the nearest available surface, left the 50 sitting on top of it, and said that if she gave him 5 minutes and access to the forward maintenance panel, he could tell her whether the problem was what he thought it was. Every technician in the hangar paused. Victor started to object. Diana held up one hand to stop him. In that gesture was a kind of dangerous amusement, the expression of someone who has decided to let something play out purely for the satisfaction of being right. She said, loudly enough that every person in the hangar could hear it clearly, "If you start that engine, I'll pay you $5 million. Devon's response was quiet and immediate. "Say that again," he said, "so everyone present can confirm they heard it." She said it again, without hesitation. He picked up his tool bag and walked to the aircraft. What followed was not a performance. Devon moved without theater, no dramatic pauses, no showmanship for the audience that had assembled around the edges of the hangar floor. He opened the external access panel on the forward maintenance section, checked each mechanical interlock in sequence, and found what he'd been looking for on the third one. The number 2 intake isolation pin had been installed in the reversed orientation. It was a small component, machined to fit correctly in only one direction under normal conditions. The reversal had required deliberate effort. In this position, the pin was sending a continuous open-circuit signal to the engine management computer, telling the system that the high-pressure intake was still unsealed. The computer, functioning exactly as designed, refused to advance past the safety checkpoint. 12 technicians had spent 4 hours examining software logs and module diagnostics for a problem that existed in a mechanical component nobody had thought to verify by hand. Devon corrected the pin orientation, checked the adjacent position sensor, confirmed the circuit path with a handheld meter, and walked to the foot of the boarding stairs. The pilot, a composed man named Hartley, who had been in the left seat since the first failed startup attempt, looked at Devon with the expression of someone who had run the sequence 17 times and had no particular faith in a 17th attempt. Devon told him to run the sequence. Hartley ran it. The left engine caught. Then the right engine answered, rising through its power range with the deep, authoritative sound of a machine that had been waiting for someone to remove the obstacle from its path. The hangar went completely silent, except for the turbines. Diana's face moved through several expressions quickly: surprise, then calculation, then something that was almost genuine respect before the composure returned. Hartley was already calling the tower. A legal assistant near the back wall was on her phone. The ground crew was moving toward the aircraft with the organized efficiency of people who had been waiting for exactly this signal. Devon did not look at Diana. He was looking at Victor Hale. Victor had not moved. He was standing in exactly the position he'd been in when the engines ignited, and something in his stillness was wrong in a way Devon didn't have a name for yet. The safety certification engineer, a woman named Priya Okafor, who had been running diagnostics at the nearest monitoring station, was watching a readout with an expression that had shifted from relief into something more troubled. Devon walked back to the aircraft. He stood beside the left engine nacelle, with his head slightly forward and his eyes unfocused, not looking, listening. Then he walked the length of the aircraft to the right nacelle and stood the same way. Then he turned toward the cockpit and raised one flat hand to Hartley. "Shut it down." Victor's voice crossed the hangar before Hartley could respond. He suggested loudly that this was a delay tactic, that Devon was extending his value before extracting a larger payment, that a Southfield contractor had no authority to stop a departure that was already behind schedule. Diana's voice was cooler, but carried the same implication. She had a window closing. Devon waited for the engines to complete their shutdown cycle. Then he walked to the monitoring station where Priya was standing and pointed at a specific section of the display. The fuel pressure in the left feed system was cycling in an irregular pattern. Not dramatically, not enough to trigger an alarm, but in a rhythm that followed a period of approximately 4 seconds, rather than the even baseline the system was designed to maintain. He told Priya to pull the data log from the last 40 minutes. She did. There was a 3-second gap in the recording at the 11-minute mark, a gap that should not exist in a continuous monitoring system. Devon turned to Diana. "The aircraft had a startup fault," he said, "because someone needed it to have one. There's also a second problem underneath that one. And the second problem wasn't designed to keep this aircraft on the ground." He paused. "It was designed to wait until you were at altitude." Victor's response arrived within 60 seconds, and it was the response of a man who had prepared for this conversation. He informed Diana that a set of fuel control components supplied by Cole Precision had been installed in the jet 3 days prior. He suggested that Devon had accessed the aircraft during that service visit, introduced the startup fault himself, and then appeared this morning to solve the problem he'd created, positioning himself to collect a $5 million reward. The logic was clean. The delivery was measured. The accusation landed in the hangar with the weight of something that had been saved for this moment. Diana looked at Devon. Devon looked at Victor with the expression of someone who had heard this particular shape of lie before and recognized its construction. Diana was not ready to declare either man credible without evidence. She asked security to hold Devon in the crew lounge pending a verification review and told Victor that nobody was to touch the aircraft data systems until that review was complete. Devon didn't argue. He handed his phone, his tools, and his signed delivery receipt to the security officer and walked to the lounge without being escorted. He understood that arguing against a false accusation in the moment of its making was the behavior of a guilty person who hadn't finished preparing their defense. He had nothing to prepare. He simply waited. Priya ran the component verification herself. The fuel control units supplied by Cole Precision were correctly manufactured, correctly certified, and installed in a section of the aircraft that was entirely separate from the forward maintenance bay where the intake pin had been reversed. The reversed pin was in an access zone that required a Marsh Aerospace employee credential to enter. It was physically outside the area a vendor delivery would reach. She brought the results to Diana in the form of a printed summary with timestamps. Diana read it twice. Then she pulled the electronic access log for the previous 72 hours and found an entry showing that Devon's vendor credential had been used to enter the forward maintenance bay at 2:53 in the morning 2 days earlier. She pulled the secondary verification. Cole Precision's own security camera placed Devon's truck and Devon himself visible in the frame at his own facility at that same hour, completing an emergency repair on a medical transport aircraft that had come in after hours. Someone had cloned his vendor access code and used it to build a paper trail. Diana did not go to the lounge herself. She sent Priya with the verification results and a straightforward offer. The company would honor the $5 million commitment if Devon signed a standard post-service confirmation stating the aircraft had been restored to airworthy condition. Devon read the document with the same attention he brought to every piece of paper a customer handed him. Then he set it on the table and told Priya to tell Diana that he was not going to sign it, because the aircraft was not in airworthy condition, and putting his name on a document that said otherwise was not something he would do for $5 million or any other amount. Priya sat for a moment before responding. She had spent enough time around people who said things like that while meaning something else to need confirmation that Devon was not one of them. He was not. She sat down. They began to talk like two people working the same problem from different ends. The conversation lasted 40 minutes and covered more than any formal briefing could have managed. Devon described the fuel pressure irregularity in terms Priya could cross-reference against her own observations. She told him she had filed 3 anomaly reports over the preceding 5 months, each one documenting a pressure variance similar to what he had identified, and each one closed by Victor with a notation attributing it to sensor drift. Devon didn't have to explain what that pattern meant. Priya had understood what it meant when she filed the second report and had been told not to raise the same issue twice. She had kept personal copies of all 3 reports on a drive that was not connected to the company network, a habit she had developed at an earlier employer where a similar pattern had ended in a runway incident that the investigation report described as preventable. Meanwhile, Diana was having a different kind of conversation. Her father, Marcus Marsh, the company's founder, 76 years old, who had built Marsh Aerospace from a borrowed hangar in Tulsa, and who had a talent for arriving at the center of a problem without being told exactly where the center was, had been notified by a board contact and had called her on her private line. He told her in the flat, unhurried voice he used for every important conversation, "Seal the aircraft, lock the data systems, and bring in an independent investigator before anyone touches anything in that hangar." She told him she needed to reach the acquisition meeting. He told her the only thing standing between her and a board-level crisis was whether she made the right decision in the next 20 minutes. And the person who would benefit most from her missing the deadline was not her competitor in the acquisition. It was her COO, a man named Raymond Cho, and it was past time she stopped treating that as a theoretical possibility. Diana did not immediately act on this because part of her was not willing to believe that the man who had served as her COO for 5 years had turned against her. She told herself Sterling might be reading old grievances into new events, but she sealed the aircraft anyway, because whatever she believed about Raymond's motives, the gap in the monitoring log was real. The cloned access credential was real, and Devon Cole's refusal to sign a document he didn't believe, turning down $5 million in the crew lounge of a company that had just publicly humiliated him, was real. She had been in enough rooms with enough people to know that the last of those 3 facts deserved the most attention. The acquisition Devon had been kept from was not incidental. Marsh Aerospace had spent 2.5 years pursuing a company called Vantage Propulsion Systems, which held 3 proprietary patents on next-generation fuel efficiency technology for long-haul commercial aircraft. The technology would allow Marsh to enter a market segment that its competitors were only beginning to understand. Raymond Cho had opposed the acquisition in 5 successive board presentations, describing it as overpriced, strategically misaligned, and disconnected from the company's core operations. He had proposed instead a partial sale of Marsh Aerospace's regional service division to a consortium called Halcyon Group, a transaction that would generate immediate cash but permanently reduce the company's independence and, not incidentally, its ability to pursue anything as ambitious as Vantage. Diana had blocked the Halcyon proposal 3 times. Raymond had not forgiven her for it. Devon and Priya, working in the hangar after Diana sealed the aircraft and authorized both of them to proceed with a full diagnostic review, found the second layer of the problem within 2 hours. The flight management software contained a modification to the fuel pressure alerting protocol, a change that reduced the threshold for automatic warnings during cruise phase by a factor of 3. A pressure variance that should have triggered a cockpit alert at altitude would instead register as a normal operating parameter. The modification was not visible in the standard maintenance log. It existed as an embedded subroutine attached to a routine update file. The update had been authorized and pushed from an executive-level account 4 days prior. Raymond Cho walked into the hangar at 5 in the afternoon with the practiced ease of a man who had decided that visibility was its own form of defense. He expressed concern about the grounded aircraft, asked about the return-to-service timeline, and within 3 minutes suggested that an outside contractor who had been at the center of a disputed financial claim probably shouldn't be directing an internal safety review. Devon had been crouched beside the aft electronics bay. When Raymond said this, Devon stood up slowly and observed that Raymond had walked directly to the avionics access port on the left side of the aircraft and positioned himself 4 feet from it without being told it was there. Raymond had not been briefed on the technical details of the investigation. He had not asked where to look. He had simply known. Priya pulled up the security footage on her tablet. It showed Victor entering the aircraft at 11:47 the previous night, moving through the cabin, spending 12 minutes in the forward avionics bay before departing. At the edge of the frame, near the hangar's secondary entrance, a second figure, too far from the camera for a clear image, but clearly present. The timestamp matched the window during which the software modification had been uploaded. Victor had the physical access. The person at the secondary entrance had the executive credentials. The story reached the press before anyone in the hangar had decided what to call it. By the following morning, the version circulating described a grounded executive jet, a disputed $5 million bet, and a mechanic from a small Southfield operation who had inserted himself into a crisis and was now obstructing a major aerospace company's return to operations. The framing was not accidental. The language in the initial report matched talking points that Diana's communications team later confirmed had originated from a media briefing distributed by an address registered to Raymond's personal assistant. 2 of Devon's commercial clients called Cole Precision to suspend their accounts, pending clarification of the company's legal situation. His insurance carrier placed 2 certifications under administrative review. An intermediary contacted him with an offer, $500,000, structured as a settlement of the wage claim from the original bet, contingent on Devon signing a non-disclosure agreement and withdrawing from the investigation. The offer arrived by courier in a letter from a law firm Devon had never heard of. He read it twice, thanked the courier, and locked it in his desk drawer. He did not accept it. He kept it because its existence confirmed something useful. Someone with significant resources was frightened of what the investigation would find if it continued. Amara found him in the shop that evening, still at his workbench, the letter locked away, and his face doing the thing it did when he was working something through. She was 15 and had her mother's patience and Devon's instinct for reading a room, which she applied to him now with the quiet efficiency of someone who had grown up watching a person carry things without asking for help. She sat on the stool near the component rack and didn't say anything immediately. "You should eat," she said eventually. "I ate." "When?" He thought about it. She went to the small refrigerator in the back and came back with a container of the rice and beans she had made the night before and set it on the workbench beside his tools. She sat back down on the stool. "Is it bad?" she said. Devon looked at the workbench for a moment. "Someone put a problem in a plane," he said. "A problem they designed to wait until the plane was at altitude and then not announce itself." Amara was quiet for a moment. "And you found it," she said. "Me and Priya. And now someone's trying to make it look like you put it there." "Yes." She considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "They picked the wrong person," she said finally. "Not as comfort, as a statement of fact." Devon looked at her. "They always think the guy from the South Field is the easiest person to bury," he said. No institutional protection, no media relationships, no legal team on retainer. What do we have? Amara said. Devon was quiet for a moment. The maintenance log from the night they say I accessed that aircraft, he said. 3 witnesses who were here. Security camera footage from our own system. He paused. And the truth of what's in that plane, which doesn't change regardless of what anyone says about me. Amara nodded slowly. Okay, she said. She picked up her phone. I'm ordering food, actual food. You can keep working. He almost smiled. She ordered from the place 2 blocks over that stayed open late, and they sat together in the shop for another hour. Devon at the workbench, Amara doing biology flashcards on her phone, both of them comfortable in the particular silence of people who knew how to share a space without filling it. Diana, watching her company's public narrative deteriorate in real time, came close to making the kind of mistake that capable people made under pressure, trying to contain the damage before confirming its source. Her father called before she could authorize a statement. He told her, with the directness that had made him both an effective founder and a difficult parent, that she had 2 choices. She could allow the narrative to define her, which meant saying nothing about Devon Cole and leaving him as the story's convenient target. Or she could be the one who shaped the narrative, which meant standing in front of her employees and saying what had actually happened, including the part where she dropped $50 at a man's feet and sent him away like an inconvenience. Devon told Priya that he didn't need Diana to defend him publicly. He needed the aircraft data preserved, the access log secured, and the investigation transferred to a body that neither Raymond nor Victor could reach. What Diana chose to say about him was her business. What she chose to do about the evidence was the company's survival. Priya found the backup data file that same evening. A pre-modification snapshot of the flight management software, automatically archived by a secondary system that Victor's team had apparently overlooked when cleaning the primary records. The backup showed the unmodified alerting parameters and confirmed the precise timestamp of the change, corresponding to Raymond's executive login session at 4:38 in the morning, 2 days before the scheduled departure. When she cross-referenced the session data against the building access log, Raymond's credential had been used to enter the facility at the same time. When she cross-referenced against Raymond's corporate calendar, his assistant had recorded him as attending a dinner function that evening, a function that had ended at 9:15. Victor was located at a roadside motel 40 miles from the state line by the afternoon of the second day. He had used his own credit card, registered under his own name, and was sitting in the parking lot when the investigators arrived. He confirmed that Raymond Cho had approached him 8 weeks earlier with an offer to settle a personal debt of approximately $240,000 accumulated through a failed investment. In exchange, Victor had reversed the intake isolation pin. His role was limited to the mechanical fault. He had not known about the software modification. He had not known what was underneath the problem he had been paid to create. Raymond's arrangement with Victor had been designed to delay the departure. The software modification was a separate intervention, one that transformed a scheduling obstruction into a potential catastrophic flight event. Someone had used Raymond's plan as cover for something considerably worse. Devon traced the modification's code signature to a security firm operating under contract to a consortium that had previously made an unsuccessful offer to acquire Vantage Propulsion Systems, the same acquisition Diana had spent 2 years pursuing. Raymond had opened a door to ground the aircraft. Someone with a different agenda had walked through it and installed something that was waiting at 38,000 feet. The board convened an emergency governance session 48 hours after the investigation findings were delivered to the legal team. Raymond's attorneys arrived with a counter-narrative. The $5 million bet was evidence of Diana acting impulsively, committing company resources without board authorization, relying on an unvetted outside contractor during a security-critical event. The argument was not without technical merit. The bet had been made publicly in the company's own facility, on camera, without any prior approval. If the board chose to read it as a leadership failure rather than a field decision under pressure, they had the paperwork to support that interpretation. Marcus Marsh did not speak in Diana's defense during the session. He did not need to. He had spent 3 days quietly confirming through his own contacts that Raymond had been in preliminary discussions with Halcyon Group about a personal advisory role, a role contingent on the Vantage acquisition failing and the Regional Service Division sale proceeding. He laid this information in front of the board without interpretation, the way a person set a component on a workbench and waited for the other person to understand its function. Diana addressed the board directly. She confirmed that she had made the bet without authorization and that the $50 she had placed at Devon Cole's feet was an act of contempt she was not going to reframe as anything other than what it was. She stated that the $5 million commitment was her personal responsibility if the board declined to classify it as a legitimate emergency service award. She placed a personal check for that amount on the table beside her father's documentation. She did not ask for approval of the decision. She asked the board to consider what the aircraft's data log would have read if Devon had signed the airworthiness confirmation she had initially offered him, and whether that outcome would have reflected better or worse on the company's judgment. Devon appeared before the board at the end of the session at Marcus Marsh's invitation. He did not address the bet or the money. He presented a single exhibit, a simulation generated by Priya's team showing what the modified alerting system would have produced during a cruise phase fuel variance at altitude and what the unmodified system would have produced under identical conditions. The difference was a warning delay of approximately 19 seconds. At cruise altitude and speed, 19 seconds was the margin between a managed engine response and a situation from which the flight crew would need both perfect information and immediate action. The board voted unanimously to retain independent oversight of the safety investigation and to suspend Raymond pending the outcome. Devon was in the shop at 6 the following morning when Diana arrived. She drove herself, without an assistant, without the composed professional architecture she wore in the hangar. She stood in the doorway of the main bay for a moment before locating him under the nose gear of an aircraft that had come in the previous afternoon. He rolled out on his creeper and looked up at her from the floor without standing, which was its own kind of statement about whose ground this was. She told him the board had authorized the $5 million payment as an emergency service award and that the documents were prepared. She also told him that the previous evening she had called Amara to explain what her father had done and why it mattered. Amara, Diana said, had listened to the full explanation and then told her, "My dad doesn't need anyone to tell him his work matters, but it's good for him to hear it from someone who isn't family." Devon stood up. He reviewed the payment document terms, asked 3 questions about language regarding his right to provide testimony in the ongoing investigation, and confirmed that no provision required him to endorse the aircraft as airworthy or restrict his communications with the investigating authority. When Diana confirmed that it did not, he signed it. He told her he was accepting the portion needed to clear the shop lease, settle the insurance review, and cover 4 months of payroll. The remainder would sit in a segregated account until the investigation concluded. She said that was his decision to make. He said he knew. The conversation that followed was not long. Diana acknowledged without prompting that she had spent 2 years watching Raymond oppose the Vantage strategy and had attributed his resistance entirely to a difference in commercial philosophy, because attributing it to something else would have required her to accept that she had misjudged someone she had trusted with the company's operations. Devon told her about a crew chief he'd served under in the Navy, a man who had signed off on a maintenance clearance under pressure from a squadron commander and had spent the decade afterward carrying the weight of what had almost happened. He said the pressure to sign something you know is wrong doesn't diminish because the consequences don't materialize. It gets heavier because you spend the rest of the time wondering when the account comes due. Diana was quiet for a moment. "You knew what you were choosing when you wouldn't sign the confirmation," she said. "Yes," he said, "even not knowing what was in the investigation, even with the money on the table. My name goes on work I believe in," he said. "That's not a policy. It's just what my name means." She looked at him for a moment, with the expression of someone updating an assessment they had made too quickly and at too great a cost. Amara stopped by the shop at lunchtime, the way she did 2 or 3 times a week when school let out early. She found her father eating at his workbench while a woman in a blazer stood nearby, studying the certification plaques on the wall with what appeared to be genuine interest. Amara read the room in the efficient way she had developed by watching her father read engines, decided there was nothing that required her to involve herself, grabbed the second half of his sandwich, said hello to the woman in the blazer, and went back to her car. The aircraft underwent a comprehensive ground systems review, 10 days after the investigation's preliminary findings were delivered to the Aviation Authority. No one flew it. Priya and Devon coordinated the technical sequence jointly, restoring the original flight management software from the backup archive, replacing the compromised signal routing in the left fuel feed system, and verifying the mechanical integrity of every maintenance interlock. They then reproduced in a sealed simulation environment the conditions the aircraft would have encountered during a cruise phase fuel variance, first with the modified software, then with the restored system. With the modification in place, no audible alert for the first 17 seconds of the variance. With the restored system, the anomaly flagged in under 4 seconds, routed simultaneously to both crew displays. The report went to the board, to the Aviation Authority, and to 3 members of the press on the same day in the same format. Diana had argued for a sequential release that would allow the company to manage the story. Devon had pointed out that simultaneous release was the only version of transparency that would actually function as transparency. Marcus Marsh had agreed before Devon finished the sentence. Diana agreed 2 beats later. Raymond Cho was suspended that afternoon and referred to the Attorney General's Office for investigation of securities fraud, material misrepresentation to the board, and his role in facilitating the unauthorized access that had enabled the software modification. His attorney released a statement attributing everything to a misunderstanding of strategic intent. The acquisition timeline that Raymond had presented to the board as immovable, the deadline Diana had believed was closing, had been fabricated. Vantage Propulsion's board confirmed that the document circulating as a signed agreement was a draft term sheet that had never been executed, and that their preferred counterparty remained Marsh Aerospace, contingent on completion of due diligence. The pressure that had been designed to make Diana miss the window had never been real. Marcus Marsh offered Devon the position of Director of Safety Operations 2 weeks later, in a meeting at the main facility with Diana present. Devon listened to the full offer. Then he declined it. He explained that what the company needed was not a safety director who reported to the CEO. It needed an independent certification authority that reported to no one inside the company at all. He proposed converting Cole Precision into an arm's-length inspection and training center, funded by Marsh Aerospace, but governed by a charter that explicitly prevented the company from overriding a technical finding. The center would certify technicians, conduct independent audits of maintenance records, and provide a protected channel through which employees could raise concerns without routing through a management chain that might have reasons to suppress them. Priya, who was in the meeting, said nothing during Devon's presentation, but Diana noticed her write one word in the margin of her notepad. Finally. Diana agreed to the proposal. In agreeing to it, she accepted something that most executives in her position would not accept: a permanent external check on decisions that had previously been internal. She said so to the board when presenting the arrangement, that the presence of such a check was not a constraint on the company's ability to operate. It was the structure that made the company's operations worth trusting. Marcus Marsh shook Devon's hand after the board session and told him in the plain way he said things that the proposal was the most intelligent thing he'd heard in the building in several years. Devon thanked him and asked if someone could validate his parking. The $50 bill had not been discarded. Diana had retrieved it from the hangar floor herself that same morning. When she addressed the full company staff 3 weeks later, without a prepared statement, in the main hangar, standing in front of everyone who had been there when she placed it at his feet, she had it with her. She did not describe what she had done as a mistake in judgment. She said it was contempt, and that contempt was a choice, and that choices lived with you regardless of how they turned out. She had the bill framed and placed in the conference room of the new Independent Inspection Center at a height where anyone sitting at the training table would see it clearly. She did not attach a written explanation to the frame. She told Devon that an explanation was only necessary for people who hadn't been in the hangar that morning, and if they needed the story explained to them, the frame was the wrong place to start. Cole Precision expanded to a second facility on the north side of the field 8 months later, absorbing 4 technicians from Victor Hale's former team who had passed the independent certification review and who had, Priya noted in her recommendation letters for each of them, been filing anomaly reports internally for months before anyone with authority had chosen to listen. Devon kept the original shop open. He kept the original crew together. The original shop was where he understood how to be, and some things did not need to be made larger in order to become better. The relationship between Diana and Devon evolved slowly, without announcement, in the way that things evolved between people who had stopped performing certainty and started being honest about what they didn't know. She came to the shop without her calendar. He learned to see past the precision that had made her effective to what it had cost her to maintain it for as long as she had. Neither of them moved quickly. Neither of them had a reason to. The aircraft completed its certification review and returned to service on a clear morning in late October. Diana had offered Devon the seat across from hers for the initial flight. He told her he had a generator diagnostic that couldn't wait. He drove Amara to the edge of the runway fence instead and stood with her and 2 of his crew while the jet taxied out. The turbines climbed through their sequence, found their register, and held it. Devon watched the nose lift. He felt the familiar satisfaction of a machine doing exactly what it had been designed to do, not because someone had forced it, but because someone had taken the time to understand it. "How does it feel?" Amara said. Devon was quiet for a moment. "Like it should," he said. Amara stood beside him and watched the aircraft until it was small against the sky, and then not there at all. "Can we get food?" she said. "Yeah," he said. "We can get food." They walked back to the truck and he held the door for her the way he always did, which she accepted without comment the way she always did, and they drove out through the south gate into the ordinary continuation of a Thursday morning. There had been a moment when Diana Marsh placed $50 at the feet of a man she had assessed in 3 seconds and found insufficient. There had been 5 minutes after that in which everything she believed about the cost of a person was taken apart, not dramatically, not with a speech, but quietly, component by component, the way Devon Cole took apart everything, starting with the part that was making the wrong sound. She had offered him $5 million, and he had examined it the way he examined everything, checking not what it was worth, but whether it was something he could sign his name to. There are people who cannot be bought, not because they lack imagination, but because they have already decided what their name means, and no number large enough to change that decision has ever been printed. Subscribe. New stories every day. They're always about someone who already knew what their work was worth, long before anyone thought to ask.